Beneath the streets, deserts, cliffs, and forgotten villages of the ancient world, there are places where history did not rise toward the sky but vanished into the earth. Hidden chambers, sealed stone doors, dark tunnels, underground wells, and entire refuge cities were carved by people who knew the surface could fail. Some went below to survive war, some to protect water, some to bury their dead beyond the reach of time. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The ground gives way in silence, not in a desert storm, not under the thunder of an army, but beneath the ordinary floor of an ordinary house where a wall is opened. A passage is noticed, and the air that comes out is older than memory. It is cool, mineral, faintly stale, as if the earth itself has been holding its breath. A narrow tunnel descends beyond the reach of daylight. The first steps are awkward. The ceiling lowers, shoulders brush stone. Then the passage widens into a chamber, and beyond that chamber is another corridor, and beyond the corridor another room, and suddenly the impossible shape of the place begins to appear. This is not a cave used for a night. It is not a simple cellar cut beneath a home. It is architecture turned inward, a settlement folded into the earth, a hidden city where people once moved, waited, stored grain, guarded doors, drew water, prayed, listened and survived, while the surface above them remained dangerous or empty. Across the ancient world, the underground is never just empty space. It is refuge, memory, tomb, temple, storehouse, hiding place, water system, prison, sanctuary, and sometimes an entire second landscape beneath the visible one. Human beings have always lived under the sky, but they have also been drawn below it into rock and clay, into soft volcanic ash, limestone, sandstone, chalk, and loess. Some went underground because the climate above was brutal, some because enemies crossed the horizon too often, some because the dead needed houses of eternity, some because water, the most precious resource of all, had to be captured and protected. Others carved into the earth because their beliefs placed power beneath the surface, where ancestors, gods, spirits, and hidden forces seemed closer than the ordinary world of sunlight. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What follows is not a fantasy of lost races or secret empires without evidence, but something stranger in its own way, the real record of people who learned to make the ground itself part of civilization. The most famous underground cities can feel almost unbelievable when first encountered. In central Anatolia, beneath the wind-cut landscapes of Cappadocia, tunnels drop through soft volcanic stone into levels deep enough to hold thousands of people in time of danger. In Rome, beneath churches and streets and apartment blocks, catacombs stretch in dark galleries lined with the burial places of generations. In Egypt, the living built upward with temples and pyramids, yet some of their most powerful sacred architecture points downward into shafts, tombs hidden, chambers, quarries, and passages that treat the earth as a threshold between worlds. In China, whole communities have lived in cave dwellings, carved into hillsides and loose cliffs where the ground offers warmth in winter and coolness in summer. In desert cities, water disappears underground through cisterns, channels, and hidden reservoirs, making survival possible in places where the surface seems too dry to sustain a crowd, let alone a kingdom. Yet the word city must be used carefully. Scholars still debate how some of these underground complexes were used, how many people they could truly support, and whether they were inhabited continuously or only during emergencies. A chamber with a hearth is not automatically a home. A tunnel with a stone door is not automatically proof of constant warfare. An impressive network may have developed over centuries rather than being designed all at once by a single ruler. The evidence remains incomplete because underground places are often reused, damaged, expanded, sealed, looted, flooded, or forgotten. Later people leave their own marks on older walls. Smoke stains may belong to one period pottery to another, burials to another still. The earth preserves, but it also confuses. What survives in the record suggests something profound about ancient life. Civilization was never only what rose above ground. The palaces' walls, temples, markets, roads, and watchtowers were just the visible half of a larger human strategy. Below them, people built for fear and endurance. They stored harvests against hunger. They hid religious dead from desecration. They buried rulers with goods meant to outlast kingdoms. They carved drains to carry away filth channels, to carry water, and escape routes to carry the living away from danger. The underground world was not merely mysterious. It was practical, and that practicality is part of what makes it haunting. These places were made not by people dreaming of adventure, but by people who understood that the surface could fail. To descend into an ancient underground city is to enter a world shaped by pressure. Every surface speaks of limits. Light is limited, so lamps matter. Air is limited, so shafts matter. Space is limited, so every chamber must justify itself. Sound travels strangely, so a footstep can seem nearer than it is. Smoke becomes a threat. Waste becomes a problem. Panic becomes architecture. Doorways are narrowed. Corridors bend. Heavy round stones can be rolled across entrances. Wells may be cut so that people below can drink without exposing themselves above. Storage rooms cluster near passages where grain and oil can be protected. Stables, when present, remind us that survival underground was never only about human bodies. Animals, food tools, children, elders, and sacred objects all had to be considered, even when the evidence for their exact arrangement has been partly erased. There is also an emotional geography here. The underground offers safety but not comfort in the modern sense. It protects by enclosing. It saves by hiding. The same walls that shield a family from raiders can also trap heat, smell, fear, and uncertainty. Imagine a community moving downward with what it can carry, sealing the entry behind them, then waiting while danger passes overhead. The people below may hear nothing. That is almost worse. No hoofbeats, no voices, no sign of whether the fields are burning, whether neighbours escaped, whether the well above has been poisoned, whether the world they left at sunset will still exist at dawn. No single explanation fully accounts for every underground complex, but the repeated choice to build downward reveals a shared human instinct. When the horizon becomes dangerous, the earth can become a wall. The fascination of these hidden cities lies partly in the contradiction they preserve. Ancient people are often imagined as living openly in landscapes dominated by the seasons, the gods, and the sky. Yet many of them were also masterful engineers of darkness. They understood geology well enough to know where stone could be cut and where it would collapse. They understood air movement without modern instruments. They understood that a city does not need sunlight in every room to function for a time. They knew the value of concealment. A settlement hidden below ground can outlast the army that searches above it. A tomb sealed beneath stone can preserve a name long after the language around it has changed. A cistern buried under a desert town can keep life moving while the surface appears barren. There are popular stories that push these places far beyond the evidence, turning tunnels into proof of vanished super-civilizations, global conspiracies, or beings that lived permanently beneath the planet. Such ideas are tempting because underground spaces naturally invite imagination. Darkness is generous to rumor. A blocked passage feels like a secret. A deep shaft feels like an invitation to invent what lies below. But the archaeological reality is already rich enough. The true mystery is not whether impossible civilizations built them, but how ordinary ancient communities with tools of stone metal, ropewood, fire, and patient hands created places so large and effective that they still unsettle the modern visitor. The journey begins then with a simple reversal. Instead of looking for the ancient world only in ruins against the sky, it asks us to look beneath floors, hills, churches, deserts, streets, and fields. It asks us to notice the hidden half of survival. Under the visible world lies another record colder and quieter, where history is not written in triumphal monuments, but in worn steps, soot-black ceilings, blocked doors, storage pits, ventilation shafts, and the marks of tools that struck stone again and again in the dark. The ancient surface may have forgotten who passed through those corridors, but the corridors remember the shape of their fear, and fear carved deeply enough can become a city. The decision to go underground begins with an uncomfortable truth about the ancient world. The surface was never as stable as it looks from a distance. A village seen from a hilltop may appear peaceful, with smoke rising from hearths and fields, changing colour with the season, but that life depended on forces no community fully controlled. Rain might fail, winter might bite harder than expected, raiders might arrive before warning fires could be lit. A rival king, a migrating army, or a religious persecution might turn a familiar road into a threat. Underground spaces answered these pressures with a strange kind of simplicity. Below the surface, temperature changed more slowly. Walls did not burn, doors could be hidden, food could be kept cool, water could be protected. In many regions, the first reason for digging downward was not mystery at all, but storage. Grain is civilization's quiet engine, and grain is vulnerable. It attracts insects, rodents, damp thieves, mold, and hungry neighbors. A harvest that looks abundant in autumn can vanish by spring if it is poorly stored. Ancient farmers learned that pit cellars, rock-cut rooms, and sealed jars could extend the life of food far better than open baskets or simple sheds. In dry places underground, storage created a stable environment where seeds, pulses, oil, wine, and dried fruit could be guarded against heat. The evidence remains incomplete in many sites because storage rooms are easily reused, but where archaeologists find bins, grinding stones, amphora fragments, and traces of organic residue, the message is clear. Before the underground became a place of legends, it was often a pantry. Water pushed people below even more powerfully. A settlement can survive a bad harvest for a time, but it cannot survive without water. In arid and semi-arid regions, ancient engineers followed the logic of gravity into darkness. They cut cisterns under courtyards, tunneled channels from springs-lined reservoirs with plaster, and guided rainwater from roofs and streets into hidden tanks. Some systems were modest, serving a household or small village. Others were astonishingly ambitious, connecting public buildings, baths, fountains, fields, and caravan cities. One lesser-known detail is that underground water systems were sometimes protected as carefully as walls or gates, because a captured or contaminated water source could defeat a city without a battle. Climate also made the underground attractive. In areas with soft rock or deep deposits of loess, people discovered that the earth itself could act like insulation. The temperature below ground tends to remain more stable than the temperature above it, so a cave dwelling may feel cool during a fierce summer afternoon and comparatively warm during a cold night. This was not accidental comfort. It was environmental intelligence. In northern China, cave homes carved into less hillsides created domestic spaces that used the landscape as architecture. In parts of the Mediterranean and Near East rock-cut rooms offered shade storage and shelter from seasonal extremes. In Cappadocia, Volcanic tuff was soft enough to carve but firm enough to hold shape when properly cut, inviting people to hollow out rooms, stables, presses, churches and tunnels. Scholars still debate the full chronology of many such spaces, yet the practical appeal is difficult to miss. But comfort and storage alone do not explain the most elaborate hidden networks. Fear shaped the underground with particular force. Ancient communities lived with a nearness to violence that modern maps often hide. Borders shifted. Armies crossed farmland. Bandits exploited trade routes. Imperial struggles turned local people into targets. In frontier zones or invasion corridors, concealment could be more valuable than fortification. A wall announces where resistance is. A hidden entrance denies an enemy the certainty that anyone is there at all. Underground refugees could delay discovery, break the momentum of an attack, and protect the people least able to flee quickly. Heavy rolling stone doors, narrow corridors, dead-end passages, and ventilation shafts disguised from the surface all suggest a world in which survival sometimes depended on becoming invisible. Still, no single explanation fully accounts for all underground cities, and it would be too simple to imagine every tunnel as a wartime bunker. Some complexes were expanded over centuries, and their uses changed with the people who inherited them. A storage room might become a chapel. A quarry might become a burial chamber. A water tunnel might become an escape route. A place made for necessity might gather sacred meaning later, because human beings rarely leave useful spaces emotionally empty. The sacred pull of the underground runs very deep. Long before large cities, caves were places of image-making ritual burial and encounter with forces beyond ordinary sight. The darkness of a cave alters the senses. A lamp flame makes stone seem alive. Echoes stretch a voice into something larger than the speaker. Bones placed beneath the earth are moved into a hidden zone where memory, grief, and hope can be arranged. Ancient tomb builders understood this power. So did priests, monks, initiates, and communities that associated descent with purification, death, rebirth, or contact with ancestors. In Egypt, chambers cut for eternity gave the underground cosmic weight. Around the Mediterranean catacombs and Hypogea became places where identity could be preserved in burial. In many cultures, a chamber under the earth was not less important because it was unseen. It was more important because it was protected from ordinary time. Hidden places preserve precious things. A relic, a body, a written text, a ritual object, a store of grain, and a family's last supply of water all share one need: protection from loss. The ancient turn beneath the surface was therefore not a single invention, but a repeated response to many kinds of pressure. It emerged wherever geology allowed it, and history demanded it. People dug because the earth could cool a room, hide a door guard, a jar cradle, the dead shelter, the frightened, and hold water through a dry season. They dug because the surface could be too exposed, too hot, too cold, too visible, too easily burned, or too easily taken. Once a community discovered that the ground could be shaped, the idea expanded. A pit became a cellar became a passage became a refuge became a network deep enough and remembered long enough became a hidden city. In Cappadocia, the land itself seems half built and half eroded, as though nature began carving cities before people arrived to finish the work. Wind and rain have worn the volcanic tuff into cones ridges, pale cliffs and strange towers that rise from the plateau like stone chimneys. From above, the landscape appears open and exposed, a place of wide skies and long distances. But the softness of the rock hides a second truth. Beneath houses, valleys, courtyards, fields, and slopes, the same stone can be cut downward into chambers, corridors, shafts, churches, stables, wells, kitchens, presses and defensive passages. The surface of Cappadocia is spectacular, but its underground is more unsettling because it suggests not just shelter but planning patience and a memory of danger carved into the earth. Derinkuyu is the name that usually comes first, and for good reason. The underground city there drops through multiple levels with tunnels and rooms extending deep below the modern settlement. Its exact size is still difficult to define, partly because not every passage is open-mapped or safely accessible, and partly because underground places rarely reveal their full shape at once. What is visible, however, is enough to change the imagination. Corridors descend in tight angles, rooms open suddenly from narrow passages, ventilation shafts rise like stone throats toward the surface, storage chambers sit near workspaces. There are places interpreted as stables, kitchens, wineries, chapels, living areas, and communal rooms. Massive circular stone doors shaped like millstones could be rolled across certain passageways from the inside, turning a corridor into a blocked throat of rock. Those doors are among the most striking details. They're not decorative. They're heavy, practical, and deeply revealing. A rolling stone door makes sense only in a world where people expect the possibility of pursuit. Many are positioned so that they conceal interior sections rather than simply close an entrance. This means the underground city was not just hidden, it was compartmentalized. If one area was breached, others might remain defensible. Such architecture does not prove a single catastrophic invasion, and scholars still debate the precise periods in which different parts were cut or expanded, but it does show that the people who shaped these spaces understood fear in architectural terms. A door was not merely a boundary, it was a survival mechanism. Derinkuyu is not alone. Nearby Kaimakli spreads differently, less like a dramatic vertical descent and more like a broad underground honeycomb. Its passages twist, rise, dip, narrow and widen, creating a sense of disorientation that may have been useful. Visitors often notice how difficult it is to maintain a clear sense of direction. In a crisis, that confusion could work in favor of those who knew the place and against those who did not. Kaimakli also contains storage spaces, stables, ventilation shafts, and areas associated with food production and daily activity. The underground cities of Cappadocia were not isolated marvels, but part of a wider regional pattern. Across the area, archaeologists and local authorities have documented many subterranean settlements, refuges, tunnels, and rock-cut complexes. Some small and domestic, others large enough to suggest coordinated communal use. The reason Cappadocia could become such a landscape of hidden architecture lies partly in geology. The region was shaped by ancient volcanic eruptions that laid down thick deposits of ash, later compacted into tuff. This stone is soft enough to carve with relatively simple tools when freshly exposed, yet stable enough to stand in walls and ceilings if cut correctly. It is a rare gift for people who need shelter quickly, but it is not effortless. Every room still requires labor. Every ceiling requires judgment. Every shaft requires planning, because a mistake underground can be fatal. Collapsed stale air blocked exits, smoke and water contamination are not minor inconveniences. They are existential problems. The builders of Cappadocia may not have used modern engineering language, but they understood the behavior of their stone through experience, correction, and inherited knowledge. The chronology remains complicated. Some underground spaces may have origins stretching far back into antiquity, perhaps beginning as storage rooms, hiding places, or simple rock-cut shelters. Later communities, including Christians of the Byzantine period, clearly used and expanded many spaces, especially during times of insecurity created by war raiding and shifting imperial frontiers. The evidence does not support the idea that all of Derinkuyu or Kaimakli appeared in a single moment by one vanished civilization. Instead, what survives in the record suggests accumulation. Generations cut, widened, connected, repurposed, and remembered. A cellar becomes a passage. A passage joins another household's hiding place. A refuge gains a chapel. A ventilation shaft is deepened. A defensive door is set in place. Over time, practical decisions create something that later viewers call a city. Inside these places, the details speak quietly. There are niches for lamps because darkness has to be managed one small flame at a time. There are depressions and basins associated with processing food or drink, because even hiding people must eat and maintain supplies. There are shafts that bring air downward, sometimes extending from the surface to remarkable depths. There are wells that allowed access to water without forcing people to emerge above ground. Some wells may have been deliberately inaccessible from the surface, a detail that makes grim sense in a siege or raid. If an enemy cannot find the people below, he also cannot easily poison their water. This is not romantic architecture. It is architecture created under the shadow of practical terror. A surprising feature of Cappadocia's underground settlements is how social they are. They are often described as hiding places, but hiding at this scale is not a private act. A family can hide in a cellar. A village hiding underground requires rules: who closes the stone door, who controls lamps, who distributes food, where are animals kept, how is waste handled, who watches the passage, who decides when it is safe to return. The archaeology cannot answer every question, and no single explanation fully accounts for how each complex functioned, but the layout implies coordination. Underground survival was not simply a matter of having a hole in the ground. It required trust, discipline, and shared knowledge of a place that outsiders would find confusing. The most haunting thing about Cappadocia is that the hidden cities sit beneath an already strange landscape, as if two worlds were stacked together. Above there are rock-cut churches, painted chapels, monastic spaces, pigeon houses, cave rooms, and valleys glowing under the Anatolian sun. Below, the same culture of carving turns inward and defensive. The people of Cappadocia did not merely occupy the landscape, they entered it, hollowed it, and made it a partner in survival. Their cities are not ruins in the ordinary sense. Their absences shaped into use. Their rooms made by removing stone streets made without sky neighborhoods, without horizons. And when a person steps down into Derinkuyu or Keimakli, the first impression is not of grandeur, but of compression, the sense that history here did not rise in columns and palaces, but withdrew into the ground and waited. To imagine life inside a darkened city, it helps to remove almost everything that makes a city feel familiar. There is no skyline, no market square brightening with morning, no road dust, no birds moving between rooftops, no changing weather visible from a doorway. There is stone breath lamps, smoke stored, food, low voices, animal heat, and the long uncertainty of waiting. An underground refuge like those in Cappadocia was not meant to be comfortable in the way a permanent home above ground might be comfortable. It was designed to make survival possible when the surface had become more dangerous than the depths. That difference matters. These were not fantasy kingdoms beneath the earth. They were emergency worlds shaped by discipline, fear, and practical intelligence. The first problem was light. Without light, even the most carefully planned passage becomes hostile. Small lamps would have been essential, likely using oil or fat depending on period and supply, placed in niches or carried by hand. Their glow would have been weak and uneven, revealing only a few steps ahead while leaving corners in darkness. Every flame consumed fuel and oxygen, and every flame produced smoke. The ceilings of underground spaces often preserve dark stains that speak of repeated burning, though the evidence remains incomplete because smoke marks can belong to many different phases of use. Still, the basic reality is unavoidable. Light underground was never free. It had to be rationed, maintained, protected from drafts, and kept away from panic. Air was even more important. Modern visitors often notice the ventilation shafts before they understand their significance. A deep underground complex without air circulation becomes unlivable very quickly, especially if people, animals, lamps, and cooking fires are all present. These shafts in Cappadocia are not decorative voids. They are lifelines. Some descend through multiple levels, drawing fresh air into the chambers below and allowing stale air to escape. The builders may not have understood airflow through modern physics, but they understood it through experience. They knew which passages felt dead and which breathed. They knew where smoke gathered. They knew that a hidden city could fail invisibly, not from an enemy breaking through a door, but from the slow thickening of the air. Food storage must have dominated the rhythm of underground survival. Grain-dried legumes, preserved fruits, oil, wine, and other durable supplies could keep a community alive for a limited period, but only if they'd been prepared before danger arrived. A refuge is only useful if it is already stocked. This detail reveals how closely underground life was tied to memory and planning. People had to imagine future danger while the present was still calm. They had to move jars, tools, bedding, fodder, and valuables into protected spaces before the crisis fully began. What survives in the record suggests that many underground chambers were suited for storage with cool temperatures and enclosed rooms helping protect supplies. Yet scholars still debate how long large populations could have remained below. The answer likely varied. Some stays may have lasted days, others perhaps weeks. A hidden city could prolong life, but it could not suspend ordinary human needs forever. Water made the difference between a shelter and a true refuge. Wells cut inside underground cities allowed people to drink without exposing themselves at the surface, and in some cases these wells appear designed so they could not easily be accessed or contaminated from above. This is a quiet but remarkable defensive idea. It shows that danger was imagined not only as a sword at the doorway, but as an enemy capable of poisoning, blocking, or controlling resources. In the darkened city, water would have been watched carefully. Containers had to be filled. Spillage mattered. Animals needed water too. Children, elders, and the sick would have needed more attention. The deeper the refuge, the more every practical action became a shared responsibility. Animals complicate the image further. Some underground spaces are interpreted as stables, and whether every identification is certain or not, the presence of animals in refuge settings makes sense. Livestock represented wealth, transport, food, milk, labour, and future recovery after danger passed. To save only people while losing animals could mean surviving the raid but facing ruin afterward. Yet animals underground also meant noise smell, dung disease risk, and greater demand for fodder and water. Their bodies would warm the chambers, their movement would need control, and their fear could spread quickly in confined space. The underground city was therefore not silent. It likely contained the scraping of hooves, the shifting of jars, the cough of smoke-filled throats, the murmur of people trying not to speak too loudly, and the occasional sudden sound that made everyone freeze. Social order would have been as necessary as architecture. A labyrinth can protect a community only if the community knows how to use it. Someone had to understand the routes. Someone had to decide which passages remained open and which were sealed. Someone had to manage food, water lamps, animals, tools, and waste. The massive rolling stone doors imply moments of decision. Once a door was closed, those behind it were safer from pursuit, but also more enclosed. If the wrong passage was sealed too early, people could be cut off from supplies or from one another. No single explanation fully accounts for the lived experience of these places, but their design suggests that underground survival required rehearsal habit, or at least inherited knowledge. The city below had rules because without rules it would become a trap. Waste is one of the least romantic and most important parts of the story. Long-form myths about hidden cities often ignore it, but ancient people could not. Human waste, animal dung, spoiled food, smoke residue, broken pottery and dirty water all had to be managed. Some refuse may have been stored temporarily carried out when it was safe or confined to designated areas. The archaeological record can be difficult to interpret because later cleaning, reuse and collapse erase many traces. Yet the problem itself is certain. The longer people remained underground, the more sanitation mattered. A refuge that protected people from soldiers could still threaten them through illness if it became foul, damp and overcrowded. There may also have been sacred spaces within the darkness. In Cappadocia, later Christian communities cut chapels and religious rooms into rock, and some underground complexes include spaces interpreted in connection with worship. In a crisis, belief would not have been separate from survival. A community hiding underground carried not only food and tools, but its sense of meaning. Prayers, rituals, remembered saints, family dead, sacred objects, and communal identity could all help people endure confinement. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is important not to turn every chamber into a chapel or every niche into a shrine. Still underground, life would have sharpened the need for reassurance. Darkness makes practical things urgent, but it also makes unseen things feel close. The most difficult part to recover is fear. Archaeology can measure a corridor, identify a shaft, and map a chamber, but it cannot fully restore the feeling of waiting behind a sealed stone door. The people below may not have known whether the danger above would pass quickly or settle over the land for days. They may have worried about relatives caught outside fields, destroyed houses, searched stores, burned, or entrances discovered. Children had to be kept quiet. Lamps had to be shielded. News moved slowly if it moved at all. The underground city compressed time. Hours in darkness can feel longer than days in the open air, and yet these places are not only monuments to fear, they are monuments to adaptation. They show people thinking ahead, reading stone, organizing space, protecting the vulnerable, and refusing to surrender the surface entirely, even when they had to leave it for a while. The darkened city was a pause, not an ending. Its purpose was to hold life in suspension until doors could open, smoke could rise again from houses, animals could return to fields, and people could step back into sunlight carrying the strange memory of having lived beneath their own world. Above the hidden chambers of Cappadocia, history rarely stayed still. The plateau sat in a difficult position, not at the quiet edge of the ancient world, but along routes where peoples, armies, traders, religions and empires repeatedly crossed one another. Its valleys and highlands could appear remote, yet they were never truly isolated. Roads moved through central Anatolia like veins between larger powers. Control passed from one kingdom to another, from Persian influence to Hellenistic rulers, from Roman administration to Byzantine frontier life, and later through the pressure of Arab raids, Turkic migrations, Seljuk power, Mongol disruption, and Ottoman order. The names of empires changed above ground. Beneath them, the carved rooms remained waiting for the next generation to discover that stone could remember what politics forgot. Cappadocia's underground cities make most sense when they are seen against this long instability. They were not built for one dramatic night alone. They belonged to a landscape where danger returned in waves. A village might enjoy years of ordinary life, then suddenly find itself exposed to a raiding force. a military campaign, a local conflict, or the pressure of religious change. The people who used the underground did not need to believe the world was ending every day. They only needed to know that history could turn quickly. In such a place, a hidden refuge was like a second harvest stored beneath the first, not always used, not always visible, but essential when the season failed. The Roman and Byzantine periods are especially important for understanding the growth and use of many Cappadocian underground spaces. Cappadocia became part of the Roman world, and later it lay within the Eastern Christian Empire that modern historians call Byzantine. The region developed strong Christian communities, monasteries, rock-cut churches and religious settlements. Its soft stone made sacred carving possible on a grand scale, and the valleys still hold chapels with painted walls, apses, columns shaped from living rock, and traces of devotion left in pigment and soot. But the same Christian landscape also existed near zones of conflict. From the 7th century onward, Arab-Byzantine wars brought repeated raids and frontier insecurity into Anatolia. Scholars still debate exactly how much these raids drove the expansion of particular underground cities, but the defensive logic of many passages fits a world in which hiding, sealing, and waiting could save lives. Persecution is often mentioned in popular accounts, especially the idea that early Christians hid in vast underground cities from Roman authorities. There may be pieces of truth in the broader pattern of underground religious use, but the simple version is too neat. The evidence remains incomplete, and many of the largest Cappadocian refuge systems appear to have been developed or heavily used in later periods, rather than during the earlier centuries of Christianity. It is safer to say that underground spaces served different communities at different times, including Christian populations facing danger, during periods of invasion, political instability, or local violence. The real story is not less compelling for being more complex. It shows how a useful architecture can outlive the first people who cut it and become valuable again whenever history darkens. Imagine a settlement on the plateau during a time of warning. Perhaps smoke is seen in the distance. Perhaps travellers bring news of raiders moving along a road. Perhaps local leaders know that armed men can arrive faster than families can scatter safely across open ground. The surface settlement begins to change before the enemy appears. Grain is moved, animals are gathered, lamps, jars, bedding tools, and sacred objects are carried toward hidden entries. The oldest people remember which passage bends left, which room stays cooler, which shaft breathes best, which door must be sealed last. Children are instructed to keep quiet. The entry is disguised or closed. Above ground, a village may look abandoned. Below it is not abandoned at all. It is simply withdrawn from sight. This strategy is very different from the grand defences associated with famous ancient cities. A wall is proud. A fortress declares itself. A hidden refuge is humble and suspicious. It accepts that a community may not be able to defeat the danger directly. It does not seek glory. It seeks continuation. That is one of the most human things about Cappadocia's underground settlements. They are not monuments to conquest. They are monuments to endurance without applause. Their builders did not carve triumphal inscriptions across every tunnel. They left tool marks, lamp niches, worn thresholds, and defensive stones. What survives in the record suggests people less interested in being remembered than in making sure someone remained alive to remember anything at all. The pressures did not end with the Byzantine world. Anatolia continued to transform through the arrival of Turkic groups and the rise of new political powers. Communities shifted language, faith, identity, and allegiance over time. Some underground spaces may have remained known, locally reused as storage shelter, animal housing, or emergency retreats. Others were sealed, forgotten, or incorporated into ordinary village life so completely that their older meaning faded. A person might live above a passage without fully understanding how far it descended. A cellar might be part of a much larger system. A blocked wall might hide a corridor no one had entered for generations. Underground architecture is especially vulnerable to this kind of forgetting, because it has no skyline. Once an entrance is lost, a city below can disappear without moving an inch. There's a lesser-known irony in this. The very features that made underground cities useful in times of danger also helped erase them from history. Concealment protects, but concealment also hides evidence from later memory. A palace ruin can remain visible for centuries even when stripped of stone. A buried refuge may vanish behind a plastered wall, a collapsed passage, or a changed doorway. Local stories might preserve hints of tunnels, hidden rooms, or old shelters, but stories shift. By the time modern discovery begins, the underground city can feel like a sudden revelation, when in reality it may have been the result of many centuries of carving use, abandonment, reuse, and silence. No single explanation fully accounts for the relationship between empire and refuge in Cappadocia. It was not simply that one invading army caused one underground city to be made. The pattern is broader and more patient. Empires above ground created roads, wealth, taxation, military movement, religious centres and administrative order, but they also created targets, frontiers, conflicts, and sudden reversals of power. When authority was strong, communities might live openly, trade, worship, farm, and build. When authority weakened or danger approached, the same communities could turn inward and downward. The underground city was therefore not outside history. It was one of history's answers. This is why Cappadocia feels so important in the larger story of ancient hidden cities. It shows that the underground is not merely a curiosity beneath the surface, it is a political landscape. Every passage carries the shadow of events above it. Every sealed stone door suggests a world where ordinary people had to read the movements of empires and prepare for their failures. The great powers left names in chronicles and coins. The people below left rooms in the rock. And in some ways those rooms tell a quieter but more intimate truth. For most human beings, the fall or rise of empires was not experienced as an abstract historical process. It was experienced as footsteps on roads, rumours in markets, smoke beyond hills, and the decision to lead one's family down into the earth until the surface became survivable again. From Cappadocia's defensive darkness, the descent turns south toward a different kind of underground world, one where the earth is not only shelter from danger, but a passage into eternity. Egypt's most visible monuments rise in sunlight pyramids on the plateau temple, pylons against the desert obelisks cutting into the sky statues facing the river wind. Yet Egyptian civilization also gave some of its deepest attention to spaces no crowd was meant to see. Beneath cliffs' desert floors, temples and cemetery fields, Egyptians cut shafts, corridors, chambers, quarries, tunnels and ritual caverns. Their underworld was hidden because it mattered too much. The Egyptian landscape almost demanded this double vision. The Nile Valley is a narrow ribbon of green bordered by desert and stone where life and death stand beside each other with unusual clarity. Fields renew themselves after inundation. The desert beyond remains dry, bright, and seemingly timeless. For thousands of years, Egyptians placed the dead in that desert margin close enough to the living world to be remembered far enough into dryness to be preserved. Early graves were simple pits, but even a pit is an underground idea, placing the body beneath ordinary sight, where the living can no longer touch it casually. Over time, that idea expanded into mastaba's pyramids, rock-cut tombs, hidden valleys, and elaborate chambers designed as houses for a transformed existence. The pyramids can mislead the imagination because they seem to be all about upward mass, but their meaning depends on concealed interior spaces. The burial chamber lies hidden within or beneath the monument, reach through passages that compress the body, and direct movement with almost theatrical control. Later, when royal burial shifted to the Valley of the Kings, the monumental mountain replaced the monumental pyramid. Tombs no longer announced themselves with giant stone geometry on the horizon. They cut into cliffs and wadis, turning the desert itself into a sealed architecture of death. Painted walls carry scenes from funerary texts, and chambers open like stations along a dangerous route. The king's night journey is translated into stone plaster pigment and darkness. This is where Egypt's underground differs sharply from Cappadocia. In Cappadocia, the dark city waits for the living to return to the surface. In Egypt, many underground spaces are built for those who will not return in ordinary form. The tomb is a controlled environment for transformation. It protects the body, the name, the image, the offerings, and the ritual equipment believed necessary for continued existence. What survives in the record suggests a culture intensely concerned with continuity after death, but not simple obsession. Egyptian burial practice was also social, political, economic, artistic, and technical. A tomb displayed status, employed workers, consumed materials, and turned geology into theology. Some of the most striking underground Egyptian places are not royal tombs at all. At Saqqara, the Serapeum holds long galleries cut for the burial of sacred Apis bulls animals, associated with divine power and royal legitimacy. Massive stone sarcophagi sit in the darkness, showing the labor a religious system could mobilize for beings that were not human kings. The corridors are severe, almost industrial in their weight, and they remind the visitor that sacred underground space could be both intimate and enormous. Scholars still debate details of dating, construction, logistics, and ritual sequence at many such sites. But the broad pattern is clear. The earth received not only rulers, but animals, priests, elites, officials, and sacred symbols. Labor is the hidden companion of all this sacred depth. Every descending corridor began as someone's physical burden. Men cut into limestone with tools, lamps, baskets, ropes, wooden supports, and hard-earned knowledge of the rock. Tomb workers shaped chambers that might later be sealed forever. At Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans who worked on royal tombs preserves a rare glimpse of the human machinery behind the Valley of the Kings. These were skilled workers with families' disputes, wages, and anxieties of their own. The painted underworlds were made by people who knew dust-darkness deadlines, and the risk of a ceiling that did not behave as expected. Quarries add another layer to Egypt's underground story. The ancient state depended on stone, and stone had to be extracted before it could become temple statue, sarcophagus, column, or wall. Some quarries were open cuts, while others pushed into cliffs and hillsides, creating artificial caves where labourers followed usable seams. At places such as Gebel el-Silsila, the landscape still bears the marks of extraction. A temple above ground could begin as a wound within the rock, and the same civilization that filled the visible world with sacred stone also left behind the negative spaces made by removing it. There were also underground chambers connected to water rebirth and mythic geography. Egyptian religious imagination placed great importance on the journey of the sun through the night, the realm of Osiris, and the renewal that comes after darkness. Some temple complexes included crypts, hidden rooms, or subterranean features that may have held ritual objects or symbolic associations with creation and regeneration. The evidence remains incomplete because many such spaces were altered, robbed, damaged, or reused, and modern interpretation must be cautious. Still, the pattern is powerful. To go below in Egypt was often to move into a zone where death and beginning touched each other. Tomb robbery proves that hiddenness was never perfect. Ancient builders sealed passages, filled shafts, concealed entrances, and used architectural tricks, yet many tombs were violated in antiquity. The underground promised protection, but it also attracted those who knew treasure might be buried there. This produces one of Egypt's great contradictions. The more carefully a tomb stored wealth and sacred equipment, the more tempting it became to people living through hardship or opportunity. Relatively intact tombs are famous precisely because intactness was rare. Egypt's underground world is not a single city beneath the desert, but a vast scattered civilization of chambers and passages, each carrying a different purpose. Some were cut for kings, some for sacred animals, some for officials, priests, workers, or families. Some were made to remove stone, others to hide it forever around a body. Some were practical, others cosmic, and many were both at once. No single explanation fully accounts for the Egyptian descent into the earth, because the earth served too many roles. It was a quarry, a womb, a vault, a horizon of the dead, a place of work and a sacred night through which rebirth might be imagined. If Cappadocia shows people disappearing underground to survive history, Egypt shows a civilization entering the ground to outlast time itself. Alexandria is a city built on crossings. It stands where the Nile's world meets the Mediterranean, where Egyptian sacred geography meets Greek urban planning, where Roman power later settles over both, and where the sea constantly reminds the city that stone is not as permanent as rulers pretend. Unlike the cliffs of Cappadocia or the desert cemeteries of Egypt's older capitals, Alexandria's underground world is tangled with water trade, burial collapse, and reuse. The city above was famous for its lighthouse, royal quarter, library, harbour, and restless mixture of peoples. But beneath the streets, another Alexandria took shape in cisterns, catacombs, drains, shafts, tomb chambers, and ruins slowly swallowed by rising ground and shifting coastline. The first thing to understand is that Alexandria was never purely Egyptian in the older pharaonic sense, nor purely Greek, nor simply Roman after conquest. Founded by Alexander the Great and developed by the Ptolemies, it became a capital where Macedonian rulers governed Egypt while adopting Egyptian symbols of kingship. Greek language and institutions dominated official life, but Egyptian religion, local labour, older traditions, and the Nile's rhythms remained impossible to erase. Later, under Rome, the city kept its importance while becoming part of an empire that depended on Egyptian grain. This blending did not only happen in temples and palaces, it happened underground, where burial customs, engineering needs, and urban growth pressed different traditions into the same stone. The catacombs of el-Shokhafa reveal this mixture with unusual force. The name is modern, connected with the mound of broken pottery once found there, but the ancient complex descends into a world where styles meet in the half-light. A spiral staircase leads downward around a shaft, suggesting the movement of bodies, mourners, and materials into the burial levels below. Chambers open into spaces decorated with a fascinating fusion. Egyptian funerary imagery appears beside Greco-Roman architectural forms, and figures may wear one civilization's symbolic clothing while standing in another's artistic language. The effect is not confusion exactly. It is a city thinking in more than one tradition at once. These catacombs were not underground cities for the living, but they were social spaces, and that distinction matters. Burial in Alexandria could involve gathering ritual meals, family memory, and the repeated return of the living to the dead. In el-Shokhafa, a banquet hall known as a triclinium suggests that mourners may have eaten in connection with funerary rites. The dead were placed in loculi sarcophagi, and chambers cut into the earth, while the living descended temporarily carrying lamps and offerings. The underground became a place where grief was organized, where identity survived death, and where a mixed population could express belonging through hybrid forms. What survives in the record suggests not a hidden refuge from invasion, but an underworld of memory beneath a crowded port city. Alexandria's underground was also practical in a more urgent way. Water had to be stored, managed, and distributed. The city had access to the sea, but seawater could not sustain households, baths, workshops, animals, and gardens. Fresh water came through canals and systems connected to the Nile, then had to be stored in cisterns that could serve a dense urban population. Beneath Alexandria, large vaulted cisterns were built and rebuilt over centuries, some with rows of columns and carefully plastered walls. They are among the city's most impressive hidden structures, yet they rarely capture the popular imagination, like the Lost Library or the Lighthouse. A city can survive without scholars for longer than it can survive without water. The cisterns show how underground engineering can become almost invisible because it works too well. A reservoir under a street does not announce itself. People above may know that water arrives, fills jars, supplies fountains, and supports daily life, but the architecture below remains out of sight. In Alexandria, where earthquakes, subsidence, rebuilding, and changes in sea level have altered the urban landscape, such hidden infrastructure becomes even harder to follow. Some ancient remains lie beneath later neighbourhoods. Some are underwater near the old royal quarter and harbour. Some are known through excavation, others through chance discovery, and still others through traces that scholars still debate. The evidence remains incomplete because Alexandria has been lived in for so long that one city sits on top of another. There is something haunting about an underground system in a city associated with lost knowledge. The famous library has become a symbol of disappearance, though popular stories often simplify its destruction into one dramatic fire. In reality, the loss of Alexandria's scholarly world was more gradual and complicated, tied to political change, violence, neglect, shifting institutions, and the fragility of texts. The underground ruins echo that pattern. They rarely vanish in a single moment. They are flooded, filled, built over, forgotten, rediscovered, misidentified, and reinterpreted. No single explanation fully accounts for Alexandria's buried past, because burial there is not only archaeological. It is geological, urban, political, and marine. The sea is the quiet force beneath all of this. Ancient Alexandria's coastline has changed, and parts of the old city, especially around the royal quarter and harbour, have been affected by subsidence and earthquakes. Columns, statues, blocks, and architectural fragments have been found underwater, reminders that the boundary between buried and drowned history can be thin. In most underground cities, descent means going into the earth. In Alexandria, descent can also mean going below the waterline into a drowned extension of the ancient urban world. The city does not merely hide under soil. Parts of it have slipped toward the sea, where waves move over stones once shaped for royal display. The catacombs, cisterns, and submerged ruins together create a different kind of hidden city from Cappadocia or the Valley of the Kings. Alexandria's underworld is not a single coherent refuge or sacred necropolis. It is a set of overlapping necessities: bury the dead, store the water, support the streets, rebuild after damage, and keep living as the ground itself changes. Its underground spaces speak the language of a metropolis rather than a village or royal cemetery. They show crowding cultural mixture, infrastructure, and adaptation. They show that ancient urban life depended on systems most people rarely saw, and in that darkness, the city's identity becomes clearer. Alexandria was always a place of surfaces that dazzled outsiders, The lighthouse flame, the marble, the harbour, the palaces, the reputation for learning. Beneath those surfaces, the real work of continuity took place. The dead were remembered in hybrid chambers, water waited in vaulted reservoirs, older structures sank under newer ones, the sea took what the land could not hold. Alexandria's hidden world is not silent because nothing happened there. It is silent because so much happened that the layers became inseparable, pressed together beneath a city that kept rebuilding itself over its own memory. Rome is usually imagined as a city of surfaces, marble temples, crowded forums, triumphal arches, aqueducts crossing the skyline roads hard with military ambition, and amphitheatres where empire turns spectacle into stone. But Rome also has another body darker and more layered, pressed beneath streets that have been walked for more than 2,000 years. The city does not simply sit on its past. It buries it, builds over it, drains through it, prays inside it, and sometimes forgets it so completely that a buried street can lie below a church, below a medieval wall, below a modern road, like a sentence written 3 times on the same page without fully erasing what came before. To descend beneath Rome is not to enter one hidden city but many. There are catacombs beyond the ancient walls where long galleries cut into soft volcanic rock hold the burial spaces of early Christian and Jewish communities. There are quarries where stone was removed to build the city above, leaving caverns and tunnels that later became useful for other purposes. There are drains and sewers, including the ancient Cloaca Maxima, which helped manage water and waste in a city that grew from marshy lowlands into an imperial capital. There are crypts under churches, buried houses under later basilicas, layers of streets preserved beneath modern neighbourhoods, and underground chambers that once belonged to baths, warehouses, temples, and apartment blocks. The Roman underground is not a single plan. It is the accumulated underside of a city that refused to stop existing. The geology made this possible. Much of the area around Rome contains tuff and other volcanic materials that could be cut, quarried, and shaped. The same stone that helped build walls and vaults also allowed burial galleries to be carved outside the city. Roman law and custom generally placed burials beyond the urban boundary, so the roads leading out from Rome became lined with tombs, mausoleums, and eventually subterranean cemeteries. Along routes such as the Appian Way, the living city gave way to a landscape of the dead, but not in silence. Funerary monuments displayed names, status, family identity, and memory. Beneath some of these roads and fields, catacombs extended downward and outward in long, narrow passages. The catacombs are among Rome's most famous underground spaces, but their popular image often needs correction. They were not vast secret towns where early Christians lived permanently in hiding from emperors. That idea belongs more to later legend and romantic imagination than to the evidence. The catacombs were primarily burial places, sacred cemeteries where communities laid their dead, gathered for remembrance, and marked identity through symbols, inscriptions, paintings, and spatial arrangement. During periods of persecution, some underground spaces may have offered temporary concealment or meeting places, but no single explanation fully accounts for their use across centuries, and the evidence does not support the idea of whole populations living there for long periods. The truth is quieter and more moving. These were cities of the dead made by communities that wanted memory to survive beneath a hostile or indifferent world. Inside the galleries, the architecture is repetitive but powerful. Passage walls are cut with loculi horizontal burial niches stacked in rows, once sealed with slabs or tiles. Some chambers are larger, made for families or groups of higher status. Frescoes appear in certain spaces modest by imperial standards, but emotionally rich shepherds, meals, biblical scenes, vines, birds, and signs of hope in compressed darkness. Lamps once flickered against plaster and stone. Footsteps echoed in corridors where the air could feel close and damp. The dead were not hidden because they were forgotten. They were hidden because burial was an act of care, and care often needs protection. Rome's underground also carried the less sacred necessities of urban life. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the ancient world's most enduring drainage systems, began as a way to drain marshy ground in the valley that became the Forum and eventually developed into a major sewer. It reminds us that a great city is built not only on ceremonies and conquest, but on the movement of water and waste. Drainage is not glamorous, yet without it, Rome's monumental centre would have been unhealthy and unstable. The same civilization that raised temples to Jupiter and built imperial forums also had to solve the problem of where dirty water went after a storm, a bath, a kitchen, or a crowded market day. This practical underground rarely receives the same awe as catacombs or temples, but it may be even more revealing. Sewers, drains, and buried channels show the city as an organism. Water must enter, circulate, and leave. Waste must be pushed away from areas of prestige. Streets must be kept passable. Flooding must be managed, though never perfectly. Scholars still debate aspects of Rome's early drainage history, and the evidence remains incomplete because old systems were repaired, altered, incorporated into later works, and sometimes misunderstood by those who inherited them. Yet the larger insight remains clear: Rome's power depended on invisible infrastructure as much as visible monuments. There were also buried ruins created simply because Rome kept rising over itself. When buildings collapsed, burned, were abandoned, or became inconvenient, later builders often reused their walls, filled their rooms, robbed their materials, or built directly above them. Ground level rose over centuries. A street of one period became the basement level of another. A noble house might become a church. A pagan building might be absorbed into Christian architecture. A market structure might become a foundation. This is why modern Rome contains so many strange descents. One enters a church and finds below it earlier walls, below those older rooms, below those perhaps a Roman street or drainage channel. The past is not arranged neatly beneath the city. It is folded, crushed, reused, and interrupted. One lesser known but fascinating part of Rome's underground story is the way quarries could become something else. Cavities left by extraction did not remain empty in a city hungry for space. Some were adapted for burial, storage, shelter, or later construction. The boundary between quarry, cemetery, cellar, and refuge could blur over time. A space created by removing stone from the earth might later receive bodies, goods, or religious meaning. This pattern echoes what has appeared elsewhere. Underground architecture changes purpose as history changes above it. The Roman underground therefore reveals a capital less solid than its image. Above ground, Rome presents itself as eternal, ordered, victorious. Below ground it appears layered, improvised, damp, sacred, dirty, and human. It contains the dead who could not be separated from the living community, the drains that kept prestige from drowning in filth, the foundations of buildings that replaced other buildings, and the hollowed stone that made construction possible. What survives in the record suggests that the city's greatness was never only a matter of imperial command. It was also a matter of maintenance, adaptation, burial, and reuse. In Rome, the underground is not an escape from the city. It is the city seen from underneath. It shows that civilization accumulates by covering its own traces. The people who walked the Forum did not always know what lay below their paving stones. The medieval builders who raised churches over ancient walls did not always preserve the meanings they inherited. The modern visitor descending into a crypt, catacomb, or buried house enters not a separate world but the compressed memory of Rome itself. The surface celebrates power, the depths preserve consequence. and beneath the noise of empire there remains the quieter sound of water moving through stone lamps burning beside the dead, and a city slowly building its own shadow. Faith changes when it enters the ground. On the surface, religion can become public architecture, a temple front, a procession, a bell tower, a shrine at a crossroads, a festival moving through a city gate. Underground, it becomes narrower, quieter, more protected and more intimate. The same belief that fills a plaza with ceremony can survive in a chamber lit by one lamp beside the dead, with the ceiling low enough to remind every person that the earth is close. Across the ancient and late antique world, religious communities used underground spaces not because darkness itself was always holy, but because the ground could preserve what the surface threatened to scatter: bodies, names, symbols, memories, and sometimes the living people who carried them. This is especially clear in the burial worlds of the Roman Empire. The catacombs of Rome, Naples, Syracuse, Malta, and other Mediterranean regions are often imagined through a single dramatic image: persecuted believers hiding in endless tunnels while soldiers search above. That image is powerful, and it is not entirely detached from the atmosphere of fear that some communities experienced. But it is also too simple. The evidence remains incomplete, and the catacombs were primarily cemeteries, not permanent underground towns. They were places for burial, commemoration, ritual meals, and the expression of identity in a world where religious belonging could be fragile. During periods of danger, underground spaces may have offered temporary concealment or places of meeting, but the long galleries were made first for the dead. This distinction matters because burial itself was a form of survival. A community survives not only by keeping breathing bodies safe, but by keeping memory intact. To bury someone in a shared underground cemetery was to place that person inside a story larger than the individual life. The rows of loculi, the painted chambers, the inscriptions, the symbols of hope, the repeated visits by relatives and fellow believers all created a hidden map of belonging. In a city as large and socially layered as Rome, where wealth and status could dominate public space, underground burial allowed communities to organize their own sacred geography outside the glare of imperial monuments. The poor, the middling, and the more prosperous could all be placed within a landscape of memory shaped by faith rather than civic prestige alone. Christian catacombs are the most famous, but they were not the only religious underground spaces of the Roman world. Jewish catacombs also existed with inscriptions, menorah symbols, and burial arrangements that show the presence and identity of Jewish communities in imperial cities. Pagan and mixed funerary traditions also used hypogea rock-cut tombs and subterranean chambers. The underground was not owned by one religion. It was a shared ancient solution to the problem of death, adapted by different groups according to their beliefs and social needs. What survives in the record suggests a world where communities borrowed forms, reinterpreted spaces, and marked difference through symbols that could be read by those who belonged. For early Christians, the underground had a particular emotional force because it joined burial with expectation. Death was not treated as simple disappearance. The body mattered. The name mattered. The community of the dead remained connected to the community of the living. Paintings of shepherds, meals, vines, fish, anchors, birds, and biblical scenes did not need to shout. Their power lay in repetition, in the way small signs could turn a dark corridor into a place of reassurance. A person entering with a lamp might pass dozens of sealed niches and understand that the dead were not abandoned in isolation. They rested inside a shared hope. Yet this same darkness helped later legend grow. Medieval and modern imaginations turned catacombs into secret cities of heroic resistance, complete with hidden worship, constant pursuit, and entire congregations living for years below ground. Scholars still debate particular episodes of underground use, and in times of persecution some gatherings may indeed have taken place in hidden or semi-hidden spaces. But long-term life in catacombs would have been intensely difficult. Air-water sanitation, crowding disease, and the basic purpose of the galleries all argue against the romantic version. The truth is more restrained, and because of that more believable. People did not need to live permanently among tombs for the place to matter. They needed a space where memory could be protected when public life was uncertain. The idea of refuge, however, should not be dismissed entirely. Underground faith and survival often met in temporary ways. In Cappadocia, rock-cut churches and monastic spaces existed in a landscape that also contained defensive underground complexes. Christian communities there did not merely worship in caves because caves were dramatic. They used the stone available to them, and the stone offered both devotion and concealment. In periods of raiding or political instability, a chapel cut into rock, a chamber hidden behind a passage or a refuge connected to a settlement could become part of the same survival system. No single explanation fully accounts for all these spaces, but the overlap between sacred and defensive architecture is hard to ignore. Elsewhere, underground religion took different forms. In Egypt, descent into tombs and temple crypts carried ideas of death renewal and divine secrecy. In the Roman world, mystery cults sometimes used enclosed or cave-like spaces to create an atmosphere of initiation, though each tradition must be understood carefully rather than blended into one vague underground religion. In the city of Dura Europos, near the Euphrates, religious buildings including a synagogue and a Christian house church were not underground cities, but their preservation under later defensive fill reminds us how war can bury sacred life unexpectedly. The earth does not only receive what people choose to hide, sometimes it seals what catastrophe leaves behind. There is also a political edge to underground faith. Public religion often belongs to power. Temples, state rituals, imperial cults, and official monuments declare who controls the visible world. Underground spaces can resist that visibility. They allow smaller communities to create continuity without needing permission from every ruler. A burial chamber can preserve names that never appear in official histories. A carved sign can mark identity in a corridor where only certain people know how to read its meaning. A hidden meeting place can keep a tradition alive through a dangerous season. This does not mean every underground sacred space was rebellious. Many were legal, ordinary, and accepted. But the ground gave religion a kind of privacy that public monuments could not offer. The human experience of these spaces must have been powerful. A mourner descending into a catacomb entered a world where the city's noise faded quickly. The air cooled. The lamp flame shook. The dead lined the passage not as distant ancestors in grand tombs, but as neighbours in the walls. Every step became an act of remembering. In such a place, belief did not need grandeur. It needed endurance. Underground faith was not always triumphant, but it was stubborn. It took the fragile things a community feared losing and placed them where stone darkness and ritual could guard them. This is why faith belongs in the story of hidden ancient cities, even when no living population slept there for long. The underground was a way to survive time itself. It preserved bodies from disturbance images, from erasure names, from forgetting, and communities from dissolving into the vast anonymity of empire. The surface could change rulers, languages, laws, and fashions. Beneath it the dead waited in carefully cut rows, and the living returned with lamps carrying food, grief prayers, and the quiet certainty that a civilization is not only made by those who build upward, it is also made by those who descend, remember, and keep faith alive in the dark. In the desert, the underground begins with thirst. Before it becomes mysterious, before it gathers legends of hidden chambers and vanished caravans, it answers the simplest and most unforgiving question a city can face: where will the water come from when the sky gives nothing? A desert settlement is a wager against disappearance. Its streets may shine in the sun, its temples may be cut beautifully into cliffs, its markets may fill with spices, incense, cloth, metal, and voices from distant roads. But beneath all that visible life there must be storage channels, drains, cisterns, and cool rooms where the fragile surplus of survival is kept out of reach of heat and raiders. In desert cities, the underground is not an afterthought. It is the hidden machinery that allows the city above to look miraculous. Petra is one of the most powerful examples, though. It is often remembered first for its carved facades, rather than for the systems that made life possible around them. The famous rock-cut monuments of the Nabateans rise from sandstone cliffs, in colours that shift from rose to gold to deep red as the light changes. The entrance through the narrow sick feels like a ceremonial throat of stone, and the sudden appearance of the great facade called the Treasury can make the entire place seem like a city designed for astonishment. Yet Petra's true brilliance lies not only in what was carved to be seen, it lies in what was cut, channeled, sealed, and managed to control water in a landscape where uncontrolled rain can be as dangerous as drought. The Nabateans understood that desert water does not always arrive gently. Rain may be rare, but when it comes, it can rush through wadis in violent floods, tearing through narrow channels and vanishing almost as quickly as it appears. Petra's engineers learned to capture that violence before it escaped. They carved channels along rock walls, built dams and diversion systems, cut settling basins, plastered cisterns, and directed water through pipes and conduits towards storage and use. Some of this infrastructure is visible. Much of it is easy to overlook because it does not perform the drama of a temple front. But without it, the city's trade population gardens, animals, rituals, and travellers would have been far more fragile. What survives in the record suggests a desert people not merely enduring their environment, but negotiating with it through stone. Petra was not a fully underground city in the sense of Derinkuyu, yet its relationship with the underground was just as essential. Tombs were carved into cliffs, chambers entered the rock, cisterns held water below the surface, storage spaces protected goods from heat. The city's wealth came partly from trade routes crossing harsh terrain, and trade requires reliability. Caravans need water, pack animals need water, merchants need places where goods can be kept safe and temperatures moderated. An oasis is helpful, but engineered water is power. A city that can promise water in a dry land becomes more than a settlement. It becomes a node in a wider world of movement. The desert also teaches secrecy. A cistern hidden in rock can preserve life for those who know where it is. A channel disguised along a cliff can guide rain to a reservoir without announcing itself to strangers. A storage room cut into stone can keep grain incense oils, textiles, or tools away from the punishing sun. In caravan landscapes, knowledge of water sources could be as valuable as gold. It is easy to imagine ancient travellers reading the desert not as emptiness, but as a map of remembered well-shaded passages, guarded springs, and hidden tanks. Scholars still debate the full organization of some desert water systems, especially where later use erosion, earthquake damage, and modern disturbance have altered the evidence, but the underlying logic is unmistakable. Survival belonged to those who could make water stay. Far to the west, in what is now northern France, the underground refuge of Naar offers a different desert-like lesson, even though the climate is not desert at all. Its vast network of chalk tunnels and chambers is often called an underground city, and while much of its known use belongs to later medieval and early modern periods, rather than the ancient world in the strictest sense, it belongs to the same human pattern. When danger moves across the surface, communities carve absence into shelter. Nayar contained galleries, rooms, storage areas, and spaces where villagers could hide with animals and goods during times of war or raiding. It reminds us that the underground logic of survival is not limited to one climate. Where the desert forces people below for water and coolness, war forces them below for concealment. Other desert and semi-desert landscapes show their own versions of this hidden strategy. In the Negev and surrounding regions, ancient settlements used cisterns, terraces, runoff farming and storage systems to make marginal environments productive. Across North Africa and the Near East, underground granaries, rock-cut storage chambers and cave dwellings helped regulate temperature and protect food. In parts of Tunisia, underground or semi-subterranean dwellings used the earth as insulation, creating homes that stayed cooler than the exposed surface. In Iran and nearby regions, Qanat systems carried groundwater through gently sloping underground channels from uplands toward fields and settlements, reducing evaporation and allowing life to spread where surface streams were unreliable. These systems were not cities in the romantic sense, but they were urban foundations in the deepest sense, because without them many towns could not endure. The surprising detail in many of these places is how much intelligence is hidden in plain sight. A tourist may admire the carved face of Petra and miss the small channel underfoot. A visitor may notice a cistern only as a dark hole, and not as the difference between a thriving trade centre and an abandoned gorge. Ancient engineering often becomes invisible when it serves daily life rather than royal display. Yet it is precisely this ordinary usefulness that reveals the depth of planning. To cut a cistern is to think beyond one day's thirst. To build a diversion dam is to imagine rain before it falls. To carve a storage chamber is to understand that heat is an enemy as real as an army. No single explanation fully accounts for every desert underground space because each place answers its own landscape. Some were for water, some for burial, some for storage, some for refuge, some for worship, and many for several purposes at once. But all of them show that ancient people did not experience the desert as empty. They saw layers of possibility beneath its surface. They shaped shadow into protection stone, into memory, and hidden reservoirs into the beating heart of cities that seemed from a distance to have no right to exist. By the time the road leaves Petra's rose-coloured cliffs and follows the thought of other hidden systems across dry lands and threatened villages, the pattern has become clearer. Underground cities are not always made of streets and houses below ground. Sometimes they are networks of water tombs, storage rooms, refuges, and carved chambers that allow the visible city to breathe. The desert city survives because the ground beneath it has been persuaded to hold what the sky refuses to give. And in that quiet bargain between stone water heat and human patience, the ancient underground becomes not a place of escape from life, but the condition that makes life possible at all. Far to the east, the underground takes on another character, less like a sudden refuge beneath a threatened village, and more like a long conversation between people, soil, climate, and state power. In China, subterranean life and architecture appear in many forms: cave dwellings cut into soft earth tunnel systems used for defense, tomb complexes built as underground palaces, granaries designed to protect food, and hidden chambers shaped by war ritual and practical survival. The scale of the Chinese landscape makes any single explanation impossible. Mountains, deserts, river valleys, Los plateaus, imperial capitals, frontier zones and farming villages each produce a different reason to descend. Yet, again, the pattern returns. When the surface is too cold, too hot, too dangerous, too exposed, or too temporary, the ground becomes architecture. The Les Plateau of northern China offers one of the most remarkable examples. Loess is a fine, wind-blown sediment deposited over immense stretches of time, and often forming thick, compact layers that can stand in vertical walls when cut correctly. In parts of Shanxi, Henan and Gansu, people carved homes directly into cliff sides, or dug courtyard-like pits into the earth, opening rooms from the sides. These Yaodong dwellings are not ancient in one single moment of origin, because they belong to a long tradition that has continued into recent times, but their roots reach deep into the historical relationship between people and landscape. They show how an underground or semi-underground home can be not a temporary hiding place, but an ordinary domestic world. The practical benefits are clear. The earth moderates temperature. In a region of cold winters and hot summers, thick earthen walls can make interior rooms warmer in winter and cooler in summer than exposed structures above ground. A cave dwelling uses the hill as roof wall insulation and windbreak. It requires less timber, which matters in landscapes where wood may be scarce or valuable. It can be expanded as family needs change. It can sit close to fields, animals, and village paths while remaining partly hidden within the land itself. What survives in the record suggests not a primitive compromise but a sophisticated adaptation to environment. The house does not fight the plateau. It enters it. A Yaodong village can appear modest from a distance, even almost invisible, until the pattern resolves arched doorways in a slope, courtyards sunk below the surface, smoke rising from openings, paths descending rather than climbing. Inside rooms may be arranged around family life storage, sleeping, cooking, and seasonal work. Light enters from the open front or courtyard, unlike the deeper refuges of Cappadocia, but the sensation is still different from a freestanding house. The earth surrounds daily life. Walls are not assembled from separate materials, they're carved from the place where the family lives. Scholars still debate the earliest phases and regional variations of these dwellings, but the broader lesson is steady. Underground architecture does not always signal crisis. Sometimes it signals an old and intelligent form of comfort. Yet China's underground history also carries fear. Across periods of warfare, rebellion, banditry, and invasion, communities built or used tunnels, hidden rooms, and fortified underground passages. The details vary by region and era, and the evidence remains incomplete, because many local refugee systems were undocumented, reused, collapsed, or absorbed into later construction. Still, the defensive idea is familiar. A tunnel can connect houses, a hidden chamber can protect valuables, a buried passage can allow escape when walls are breached. In frontier zones where armies and raiding forces moved through vulnerable settlements, the ground offered a second route when roads became dangerous. As in Cappadocia, the power of such spaces depended on local knowledge. Outsiders see only a village. Residents know where the floor opens, where a passage bends, and where a family can vanish. The imperial dead went underground in a very different way. Chinese tombs, especially those of rulers and elites, often imagine the afterlife as an extension of ordered life. The tomb could become a subterranean residence, a court, a treasury, or even a symbolic empire beneath the earth. The most famous example is the burial complex of the first emperor Qin Shi Huang, guarded by the terracotta army near Xi'an. The soldiers themselves stand in vast pits arranged with military order, each figure shaped with individual variation, facing an eternity of service. The emperor's central tomb mound remains largely unexcavated, and many details are known through historical texts, surveys, and cautious investigation rather than direct opening. This uncertainty matters. Popular imagination fills the sealed tomb with wonders, but responsible history must separate what is recorded, what is detected, and what remains unknown. Even without full excavation, the complex reveals an extraordinary underground political vision. The emperor who unified warring states into an empire did not simply want a burial, he wanted continuity of command beyond death. Armies, officials, animals, entertainers, weapons, and symbolic landscapes could be placed below ground as instruments of eternity. The underground here is not refuge from an enemy, but an imperial claim against mortality. It transforms burial into governance. The ruler disappears from the surface, yet an entire order descends with him. Granaries add another essential layer. China's states and dynasties depended heavily on the storage and movement of grain. Food was power taxation, military supply, disaster relief, and social stability. Underground or semi-underground storage could help protect grain from temperature changes, pests, theft, and destruction, though methods differed greatly across regions and periods. In some places, pits and sealed storage facilities preserved surplus. In others, large state granaries were above ground but supported by controlled storage techniques and guarded infrastructure. No single explanation fully accounts for all Chinese food storage, yet the principle is familiar from the earlier sections of this journey. Civilization survives by protecting what it cannot afford to lose. There is lesser-known contradiction in these Chinese underground worlds. Some are humble and domestic, shaped by families and local conditions. Others are grand and imperial, shaped by rulers who commanded labor on a scale almost beyond imagination. A Yaodong room and an emperor's tomb seem to belong to separate universes, yet both treat the earth as a place of continuity. One preserves daily life against climate. The other preserves royal order against death. One is entered every morning. The other is sealed for millennia. Both reveal that the underground is not merely below civilization. It is one of civilization's deepest tools. By the time the story moves across China's less homes, hidden passages, tomb armies and grain stores, the ancient underground no longer appears as a single type of place. It becomes a grammar of survival and meaning. The earth can cool a home, hide a family guard, a harvest, and contain an empire's dream of forever. Above ground, dynasties rise, capitals move borders, fracture and armies march across plains. Below ground, other histories persist more quietly. A courtyard sunk into yellow earth. A tunnel remembered by villagers, a sealed pit of soldiers waiting in ranks. A store of grain meant to carry people through hunger. China's hidden cities are not always cities in the narrow sense. They are deeper than that. They are proof that entire ways of life can be built not only upon the land but within it. Every underground city is also an argument with physics. Mystery may draw the eye first, but survival below the surface depends on things that are far less romantic. Air pressure, stone strength, drainage, smoke, gravity, temperature, and the slow violence of water entering places where it should not. Ancient builders did not describe these forces with modern equations, yet they understood them through touch-failure repetition and inherited skill. A ceiling that held firm taught one lesson, a collapsed chamber taught another. A passage where lamps burned cleanly was remembered. A room where smoke gathered became dangerous knowledge. Beneath the wonder of hidden cities lies a constant technical struggle, because the earth can shelter people only when it has been persuaded not to crush, suffocate, flood, or poison them. Air is the first invisible requirement. On the surface, people rarely think about ventilation because the sky performs it for free. Underground, every breath becomes part of the design. In Cappadocia, deep shafts cut through levels of volcanic tuff allowed air to move through chambers that might otherwise have become unlivable. Some shafts also served as wells, or were connected to water systems, showing that a single vertical cut could solve more than one problem. The builders had to understand where to place openings so that the underground network could breathe without revealing too much to the surface. This was a delicate balance. A visible shaft could betray a refuge. A hidden shaft could fail to bring enough air. The evidence remains incomplete because later modifications and collapses obscure original plans, but the principle is clear. A city below ground survives only if the darkness has lungs. Smoke made the problem sharper. Lamps cooking fires, heating, and possibly torches all produced fumes. In a small chamber, smoke could sting the eyes and throat within minutes. In a crowded refuge, it could become a serious threat. This is one reason cooking may have been limited, carefully controlled, or located in areas where ventilation worked best. Soot marks on ceilings sometimes reveal where fires burned repeatedly, though scholars still debate the meaning of particular traces because smoke can accumulate over centuries of different use. Still, the challenge is unavoidable. People hiding underground could not simply recreate surface life beneath stone. They had to adapt behavior to the limits of the space. A meal, a lamp, even a moment of warmth had to be considered against the cost of air. Water was equally double-edged. Without it, no underground refuge could last. With too much of it, the refuge could fail. Well cisterns, channels, and drainage systems were among the greatest achievements of ancient underground engineering. In Petra, the genius lay in catching rare rain and directing it through stone before it vanished or destroyed. In Alexandria, cisterns stored water for a crowded city, whose brilliance depended on hidden reservoirs. In Rome, drains and sewers helped turn marshy ground into monumental space. In China and across arid regions, buried channels and storage pits made farming and settlement more reliable. What survives in the record suggests that many ancient societies understood water not as a simple resource, but as a force to be slowed, guided, separated, stored, and guarded. The surprising difficulty is that water underground is never passive. It seeps through cracks, it carries minerals, it weakens walls, it breeds dampness, mold, insects, and disease. A cistern must hold water without letting it escape. A tunnel must keep unwanted water from pooling. A well must reach the source without inviting contamination. A drainage channel must slope correctly because gravity is patient but unforgiving. Too steep and water may damage the structure. Too shallow, and it stagnates. Ancient engineers often solved these problems with plaster linings, stone channels, settling basins, inspection points, and careful attention to slope. No single explanation fully accounts for every system, but the repeated solutions show a practical intelligence born from watching water misbehave. Then there is the stone itself. Underground architecture begins with the question of what kind of earth can be trusted. Cappadocia's volcanic tuff invites carving, but even soft stone has limits. Loess can hold vertical faces when dry and compact, but it can also erode or collapse if water weakens it. Limestone can be cut into tombs and catacombs, but fractures, bedding planes, and old quarry scars must be understood. Sandstone offers beautiful carved surfaces as at Petra, but wind salt and water can eat it away over time. Chalk clay, basalt granite, and mixed soils each demand different treatment. The ancient builder's first instrument was not the chisel, but judgment. A wall had to be left thick enough. A ceiling had to curve or span properly. Pillars could not be removed just because an empty room looked more elegant without them. This is why many underground spaces have irregular shapes. They are not always clumsy, they are responsive. A passage bends because the rock demands it, because defense benefits from it, because an earlier chamber lies nearby, or because the builders follow a seam that is easier to cut. A room narrows because too much removal would risk collapse. A pillar is left standing because the ceiling needs it. In places like Rome's catacombs, the repetitive galleries may seem simple, but their survival required careful spacing of niches and corridors. In Egyptian tombs, the grandeur of painted chambers depends on hidden structural decisions made long before the first pigment touched plaster. Load is a silent presence in every underground city. Above each chamber lies the weight of earthstone buildings, roads, or hills. That weight does not sleep. It presses continuously century after century. Ancient builders learned to distribute it through arches, vaults, columns, compact plans, and conservative cutting. Sometimes they failed. Collapsed passages are part of the archaeological story, though they often remain unseen by visitors because unsafe areas are closed or cleared. The ruins that survive can make ancient engineering appear almost effortless, but survival bias hides the failures. We tend to admire the rooms that did not fall while the mistakes are buried deeper or lost. Communication and movement also required design. A narrow passage is easier to defend but harder to move through, with grain sacks, water jars, animals, injured people or bodies. A steep stair saves horizontal space, but exhausts those climbing with loads. A hidden entrance protects the refuge but slows evacuation. A labyrinth confuses enemies but can also confuse children, strangers, or panicked residents. Ancient underground planning was therefore full of trade-offs. Safety in one sense could create danger in another. The strongest stone door might become a problem if it trapped people behind it at the wrong moment. The deepest chamber might be safest from attack but most difficult to ventilate. The greatest achievement of underground engineering may be that so much of it was meant not to be noticed. Good air feels ordinary, clean water in a jar seems simple, a ceiling that does not collapse attracts no ceremony, a drain that works disappears from thought. Yet these quiet successes made hidden life possible. The ancient underground city was not a miracle carved by mystery alone. It was an accumulation of solved problems, each one small enough to be overlooked and serious enough to kill if neglected. The earth offered protection, but only to those who listened carefully to its limits. Beneath every legend of hidden chambers stands this older truth. Darkness can shelter civilization, but engineering keeps it alive. Wherever people build beneath the earth, stories follow them down. A tunnel rarely remains only a tunnel in human imagination. A sealed door becomes a forbidden passage. A deep shaft becomes a road to another world. A cave with echoes becomes a place where voices do not sound entirely human. Long after the original builders are gone, the underground keeps producing legends, partly because darkness refuses to explain itself all at once. The surface shows its ruins openly. A fallen wall, a broken column, a buried street under sunlight can be measured and described. But a passage that disappears into blackness suggests that something more may wait beyond the lamp. The ancient underground is therefore both archaeological space and myth-making machine. This is not surprising. Human beings have placed meaning below the surface for as long as they have imagined worlds beyond ordinary sight. The dead go into the ground, seeds go into the ground and return as life. Water emerges from hidden sources, metals are born in darkness before they're pulled into fire. Caves preserve cold silence and strange mineral shapes. Volcanoes and earthquakes remind people that the earth beneath their feet is not passive. It trembles, opens, burns, and swallows. In such a world, the underground becomes the natural home of ancestors' spirits, gods, monsters, treasure, punishment, rebirth, and secret knowledge. What survives in the record suggests that ancient people did not see the earth as empty matter. They saw it as a layered realm, crowded with forces that the living could enter only carefully. In Egypt, the underworld was not merely a place of gloom. It was a structured, sacred landscape through which the sun passed during the night, renewing itself before dawn. Tomb corridors and painted chambers translated this cosmic journey into architecture. The descent into a royal tomb was not just movement below ground. It was movement into mythic geography. Darkness became necessary because renewal required passage through night. The dead king did not simply lie hidden. He entered a ritual world where danger judgment, protection, and rebirth were arranged in scenes and spells. Scholars still debate the meanings of particular texts, images, and architectural choices, but the larger pattern is unmistakable in Egypt. The underground could be terrifying and hopeful at the same time. Greek and Roman traditions also filled the depths with meaning. Stories of Hades, chthonic gods, prophetic caves, sacred springs and entrances to the underworld shaped how people understood certain landscapes. Caves and fissures could become places of oracle initiation or divine presence. The idea that certain openings in the earth led toward the realm of the dead appears again and again around the Mediterranean. Some places became famous not because they were large, but because they seemed to touch another order of reality. A cave with unusual vapours, a lake with no visible bottom, a volcanic vent or a deep cleft in rock could become sacred through fear. No single explanation fully accounts for how all these places gained meaning, but geology and imagination clearly work together. The underground city also encourages stories of hidden people. In many cultures, legends speak of races beneath mountains, sleeping kings under hills, treasure guardians, dwarf spirits, saints concealed in caves, or communities that vanished into tunnels and never returned. These stories often grow around real features: old mines, abandoned quarries, tombs, drainage passages, wartime refuges, or natural caves. A villager finds a blocked entrance. A child hears wind in a shaft. A shepherd loses an animal near a hole in the ground. A sealed chamber is opened and bones appear. Over time, memory and invention braid together. The original purpose of the place may be forgotten, but the feeling of secrecy remains. Cappadocia is especially vulnerable to this kind of legend because its landscape already seems unreal. Fairy chimneys, hollowed cliffs, rock-cut churches, pigeon houses, and underground cities create the impression of a land where stone behaves like architecture, and architecture behaves like geology. It is easy for popular imagination to turn Derinkuyu or Keimakli into evidence of impossibly ancient lost civilizations or vast underground empires without support. These claims are disputed and often unsupported, especially when they ignore the long practical history of carving refuge storage worship and reuse in the region. The evidence remains incomplete in places, but incompleteness is not permission to invent without limits. The known story is already extraordinary generations of real people adapted a volcanic landscape into a hidden survival system. Rome's catacombs underwent a similar transformation in imagination. Their actual history as burial places for religious communities is powerful enough, yet later centuries often turn them into secret cities of constant persecution, where believers supposedly lived for years in darkness. The Romantic version exaggerates the evidence, but it reveals something about how people want to understand underground faith. A community that buries its dead in hidden galleries becomes in legend a community that defeats empire through silence and endurance. The myth grows because it expresses an emotional truth even when it distorts the practical one. Underground places feel like resistance because they are hard to conquer completely. Treasure legends gather even more easily. Tomb-sealed rooms and buried cities almost always attract rumours of gold curses, hidden libraries, or royal secrets. Egypt's underground chambers became famous for this, partly because tomb robbery was real. and funerary wealth did exist, but also because the idea of buried treasure is one of humanity's oldest temptations. The opening of tombs in modern times added new layers of fascination, especially when popular stories transformed coincidence, illness, and colonial-era spectacle into tales of supernatural punishment. A curse story simplifies the deeper reality. Ancient tombs were not magical traps in the way popular entertainment imagines, but sacred spaces whose violation carried moral, religious, and sometimes physical risks. Dust disease, unstable passages, and human greed can be dangerous enough without needing fantasy. Yet it would be wrong to dismiss myth as mere error. Myths preserve moods that archaeology alone cannot measure. They tell us how underground places felt to later communities, frightening, sacred, forbidden, protective, haunted, rich, or alive. A legend of a sleeping king beneath a mountain may not be factual history, but it reveals a hope that the past is not gone forever. A story of spirits in a cave may preserve an old warning about dangerous terrain. A rumor of endless tunnels may exaggerate a real network whose purpose has been forgotten. What survives in the record is stone, bone, soot, plaster pottery, and tool marks. What survives in tradition is the emotional afterlife of those places. The challenge is to hold both truths without confusing them. Archaeology asks what can be supported by evidence. Myth asks what people feared, desired, remembered, and imagined when evidence became shadow. Underground cities sit exactly at the meeting point of these two ways of knowing. They are real enough to map, but strange enough to dream about. They have dimensions, dates, materials, and functions, yet they also invite stories, because they were made to conceal, protect, bury, and transform. The deeper a passage goes, the more it seems to leave ordinary history behind, and so beneath ancient streets, deserts, cliffs, and hills, the underground becomes a mirror. People look into it and see their oldest concerns reflected back: death, survival, hidden wealth, divine judgment, lost knowledge, and the possibility that the world is larger than the surface admits. The myths born beneath the earth are not reliable maps, but they are not meaningless. They are the shadows cast by real places on the human mind. Behind them stand the chambers themselves, cold and patient, asking for neither exaggeration nor disbelief, only the humility to enter carefully and understand that darkness has always been one of history's greatest storytellers. The rediscovery of an underground city rarely begins with the grand drama people imagine. More often it begins with inconvenience. A wall cracks, a cellar opens, a farmer notices a draught where there should be none, a child throws a stone into a hole and hears it fall too long. A road crew cuts through a buried chamber. A homeowner expands a room and finds that the back wall is not the end of the house, but the beginning of a passage. The ancient underground returns to the surface not as a complete revelation, but as a question. At first there is only darkness, a current of cold air, and the uneasy awareness that ordinary ground has been hiding something larger than anyone expected. This is one reason underground cities feel so alive in modern imagination. They are not always discovered like temples standing in ruins under the sun. They are uncovered through accidents, rumours, repairs, surveys, and local memories that suddenly become more important than they seemed. In Cappadocia, many rock-cut and underground spaces were known in some form by local communities used as storage shelters, animal spaces, or curiosities, while others remained sealed or partly forgotten. Modern exploration, mapping, tourism, and archaeological attention turned these scattered known places into a broader picture of subterranean settlement. Derinkuyu, Keimakli, and other complexes became famous not because they had been completely absent from human awareness, but because their scale, connections, and historical meanings slowly came into focus. This process is never simple. An underground complex does not reveal itself like a text open to the first page. Passages collapse, Later walls block older routes. Modern safety work changes access. Tourism clears some spaces and closes others. Local use may remove evidence before archaeologists arrive. A chamber that appears ancient may contain traces from several periods layered together. A doorway cut in one century may lead into a room expanded in another. Soot pottery tool marks and floor levels do not always agree neatly. Scholars still debate dates, functions, population estimates, and phases of construction for many underground sites because the evidence remains incomplete and sometimes stubbornly ambiguous. Modern technology has changed the search, but it has not removed the uncertainty. Archaeologists and survey teams now use mapping tools, laser scanning, ground-penetrating radar photogrammetry, drone survey above-ground geological analysis, microclimate monitoring, and careful excavation to understand subterranean spaces without destroying them. These methods can reveal voids, measure complex passage systems, detect buried features, and record fragile surfaces in extraordinary detail. Yet technology cannot automatically explain intention. A scan may show a chamber, but not whether it began as a storage room, a refuge, a tomb, or a quarry. A mapped tunnel may reveal its shape, but not the fear, habit, or authority that caused it to be cut. Data can sharpen the question without fully answering it. One of the most difficult questions is population. How many people could an underground city hold? Popular accounts often give large numbers, sometimes imagining tens of thousands, hiding below for long periods. Such estimates can be tempting because the spaces feel vast when walked in fragments. But capacity is not the same as livability. A chamber can physically contain bodies for a short time and still be unsuitable for prolonged life. Air, water, food, waste animals, disease, fire, and crowd movement all limit how many people could remain below and for how long. No single explanation fully accounts for every complex, and it is likely that usage changed according to crisis. Some underground spaces may have sheltered large communities briefly. Others may have housed smaller groups more comfortably. The truth is probably less dramatic than legend, but far more practical. Dating is another problem. Underground architecture often resists easy chronology because stone does not always carry its own date. A tunnel wall may show tool marks, but tools of similar form can be used over long periods. Organic material may be absent or moved from its original place. Pottery may date one episode of use rather than the first carving. In places like Cappadocia, where spaces were reused across centuries, it can be difficult to separate origin from expansion. The oldest phase may be modest, while later additions create the impressive network visible today. What survives in the record suggests accumulation rather than a single act of planning, but the details remain debated. Then there is the question of connection. Ancient underground spaces often inspire claims of vast tunnel networks linking distant cities, temples, monasteries, or even entire regions. Some connections are real at a local scale. Passages may join houses, storage rooms, refuges, churches, or water systems. Others are exaggerations born from rumor collapse routes or the human love of hidden continuity. A blocked passage naturally invites the thought that it must lead somewhere extraordinary. Sometimes it does, often it does not. Responsible archaeology moves slowly here because a tunnel is not proof of a secret empire. It is proof that people had a reason to connect one underground space to another, and that reason may have been as ordinary as storage, drainage, safety, or convenience. Rediscovery also brings danger. Underground cities are fragile. Airflow changes when passages are opened. Humidity shifts. Walls dry out or become damp in new ways. Footsteps wear flaws. Lamps breath, and touching hands can damage surfaces. Tourism can preserve a site by funding protection, but it can also simplify it into a spectacle. A passage once used in fear becomes a route with lights and handrails. A sacred burial chamber becomes a stop in a visitor itinerary. This is not necessarily wrong. Seeing the past can create care for it, but it changes the place. The ancient underground was made for darkness, privacy, and necessity. Modern rediscovery brings brightness, explanation, and crowds. There is also an ethical question beneath the practical one. Many underground places contain the dead. Catacombs, tombs, burial chambers, and sacred caves are not merely archaeological puzzles. They were made by communities whose grief and beliefs deserve respect even when their names are lost. Excavation can rescue knowledge, but it can also disturb what was meant to remain sealed. Scholars must balance the desire to understand with the responsibility not to treat every hidden chamber as treasure waiting to be consumed. The underground asks for patience because it often preserves the most private decisions ancient people made. The unanswered questions are part of the power of these places. Who first decided to cut downward at Derinkuyu? How many generations expanded Keimakli? Which chambers were used in crisis, and which in ordinary life? How did families remember routes through darkness? How many underground spaces remain behind blocked walls in living towns? Which legends preserve real memories, and which are only shadows cast by fear in Egypt? How much has been lost to robbers, flood collapse and sand in Alexandria? How many ancient structures lie under later streets or beneath the harbour? In Rome, how many layers remain inaccessible under the living city? Every answer seems to open another door, and perhaps that is fitting. Underground cities were never meant to give themselves away easily. Their purpose was concealment, protection, separation, or transformation. They were built to hide grain from heat water, from evaporation bodies, from decay, faith, from erasure, families from danger, and rulers from oblivion. Modern rediscovery reverses that purpose, bringing hidden things back into speech. But even after surveys, excavations, maps, and careful study, something remains withheld. A passage can be measured without surrendering the moment when people last sealed it. A chamber can be photographed without restoring the voices that once moved through it. The underground gives evidence, but it keeps silence too. That silence is not emptiness. It is the final layer of the ancient city, and it may be the hardest one to excavate. The surface always forgets first. Wind softens the edges of walls. Rain carries soil across foundations. Farmers plough over stones that once marked courtyards. Shepherds rest beside openings whose original names have vanished. A city can disappear upward as well as downward, not because every trace is destroyed, but because the living world keeps using the same ground for new needs. A temple becomes a quarry. A tomb becomes a rumour. A cellar becomes part of a house. A tunnel becomes a place to store onions or keep animals cool. A sacred chamber becomes a danger to be sealed. Over time, the extraordinary becomes local, the local becomes ordinary, and the ordinary can be forgotten more completely than any ruin burned in war. Underground cities disturb that forgetting because they preserve the shape of choices made under pressure. They are not simply dark attractions beneath modern towns. They are records of what people feared losing most. In Cappadocia, communities carved the earth so life could withdraw from violence without ending. In Egypt, rulers, priests, workers, and families shaped underground chambers so the dead might continue beyond visible time. In Alexandria, cisterns and catacombs held water and memory under a city of trade and learning. In Rome, burial galleries, drains, quarries, and buried streets revealed the underside of imperial greatness. In desert settlements, hidden reservoirs made survival possible where the sky was unreliable. In China, cave homes, tomb armies, storage pits, and tunnel refuges showed that the earth could be domestic, political, sacred, and defensive all at once. What joins these places is not a single lost civilization or one secret tradition passed across continents. The evidence remains incomplete in many cases, and scholars still debate dates, capacities, origins, and exact uses. But the deeper pattern is clear enough. Again and again, humans discovered that the ground could protect what the surface exposed. The earth could hide grain from hunger water, from evaporation bodies, from decay, families from raiders, rituals from erasure, and rulers from the humiliation of ordinary death. Below ground, civilization stored its anxieties as carefully as its valuables. There is a strange humility in this. The monuments that ancient powers wanted most clearly remembered are often those that rise highest. Pyramids, columns, towers, gates, city walls, statues, palaces. They announce command. They turn labor into visibility. Underground places do almost the opposite. They are made to be entered by the few, concealed from enemies sealed, after burial protected from weather, or forgotten until needed. They do not always seek admiration. Many were successful precisely because they were not seen. A hidden well that saves a village leaves less glory than a triumphal arch, but it may matter more to the people who live through a crisis. The underground also reminds us that ancient life was more precarious than its surviving monuments suggest. Modern visitors often encounter ruins after the danger has passed, when a chamber is lit, mapped, stabilized, and explained. But the first users did not experience these places as heritage. A Cappadocian family entering a refuge did not know whether its fields would still exist when the door reopened. An Egyptian worker cutting a tomb corridor did not know whether robbers would one day break through the sealed passage. A Roman mourner descending into a catacomb did not think of archaeology, but of grief and hope. A Nabatean engineer carving a water channel in Petra was not making a romantic ruin. He was trying to keep a city alive through the next dry season. One lesser-known truth about underground survival is how much it depends on cooperation. A tunnel can be cut by labor, but it can only protect a community if people remember how to use it. Grain must be stored before hunger arrives. Water must be guarded before thirst begins. Entrances must be known and concealed. Children must be taught where not to wander. The dead must be placed with care. Ventilation shafts must be kept open. Drainage must be maintained. Underground architecture is therefore not only stonework, it is social memory. When that memory breaks, a refuge becomes a maze, a cistern becomes a pit, a tomb becomes treasure to strangers, and a hidden city becomes a mystery. That is why abandonment is rarely simple. Some underground spaces were left because danger passed and the surface became livable again. Others were abandoned because political worlds changed, populations moved, beliefs shifted, water systems failed, or maintenance became too costly. Some were never abandoned completely, only reduced to humbler uses. A sacred chamber might become storage. A defensive tunnel might become a cellar. A carved dwelling might remain a home for centuries while empires rose and fell beyond the valley. No single explanation fully accounts for disappearance, because disappearance is often gradual. Civilizations do not always vanish like lamps blown out in darkness. Sometimes they dim room by room, passage by passage, until only the architecture remembers the original flame. The hidden cities of the ancient world also challenge the way history is usually imagined. History is often told as movement across the surface, armies marching kings, building traders, crossing seas, migrants entering new lands, cities expanding outward. But underground history moves differently. It descends stores, seals, waits, and resurfaces. It is made of pauses as much as actions. It preserves the moments when people did not conquer, travel, or display power but endured. The underground is where civilization holds its breath, and perhaps this is why these places continue to grip the modern mind. They reveal a version of humanity that is both vulnerable and astonishingly inventive. Faced with heat, cold, death, invasion, drought, memory, and uncertainty, people did not merely suffer the landscape. They changed their relationship to it. They carved darkness into shelter. They turned cliffs into homes, tombs into cosmic maps, cisterns into lifelines, catacombs into communities of the dead, and soft volcanic stone into cities that could vanish beneath an enemy's feet. The surface forgets because it is always being remade. The underground remembers because it was made to hold on. So the hidden city remains as a warning and a comfort. It warns that every civilization, however confident, has a shadow of fear beneath it. It comforts because fear did not stop ancient people from building, planning, loving, burying, worshipping, and preparing for return. Beneath the visible ruins of history lies this quieter truth. Survival is not always loud, and endurance does not always leave a monument under the sun. Sometimes it leaves a narrow stair, a sealed stone door, a lamp-black ceiling, a cool chamber of stored grain, and a path down into the earth where people once waited for the world above to become possible again. In the end, the underground cities do not feel like places of escape from history. They feel like history in its most concentrated form. Above ground, time spreads outward. It becomes roads, fields, towers, markets, dynasties, borders, and names written on monuments. Below ground, time gathers inward. It clings to walls, darkens, ceilings, settles in dust, and waits in rooms where the air is cool, even when the surface burns under noon light. The people who made these spaces are mostly gone without names. Their rulers may survive in fragments, their gods in inscriptions, their enemies in chronicles. But the ordinary hands that widen the passages carried the jars trimmed, the lamps moved, the animals sealed the doors and taught children when to be silent or harder to find. Yet they are not absent. They remain in the practical intelligence of the places they left behind. A shaft cut straight enough to breathe, a chamber placed where the stone holds, a cistern plastered against thirst, a tomb painted for a journey no living eye was meant to follow. These are signatures even without names. The earth has always been both shelter and limit. It receives the dead, protects the seed, hides the spring, and covers the ruin. It can save a community for a night, or preserve a chamber for thousands of years. But it also reminds every civilization that permanence is never fully owned. The strongest walls crack. The proudest cities sink into layers. The most sacred doors are opened by strangers. The surface changes hands, languages, laws, and memories, while beneath it older worlds wait with a patience no empire can imitate. Perhaps that is the final image these hidden cities leave behind, not treasure, not conspiracy, not a lost race in the depths, but a small human flame moving carefully through a corridor of stone. Around it are stored grain sleeping children, painted dead silent wells, and the slow breath of air descending from a shaft above. Somewhere overhead the world is uncertain. Armies may pass, drought may linger, a city may rise or fall. But below for one more hour life continues. The lamp trembles, the stone holds, and the ancient earth keeps its secret a little longer.